The European conquests of the Americas set in motion a very important dynamic that would transform the nature of global history. This is an image produced by a Strasbourg-born printer. His name was Théodore de Bry, who became fascinated by tales of European encounters, particularly by the Spanish and the Portuguese, in the New World. And as an artist, an engraver, a goldsmith, he began to print a series of very important images. In a sense, they are our first images of what Europeans thought happened in the course of the first encounters with Europeans. This particular image is important for you to consider, as the conversation with Jeff earlier indicated that transactions and exchanges between Indians and Europeans were important components of the process of conquest. Europeans soon figured out that these exchanges could be very beneficial to them. While it was tempting to plunder Tenochtitlan and take out all the gold that the Aztec Empire had accumulated, and this was certainly what Cortés, and in the case of the Inca Empire, Pizarro, was after, it soon became clear that the sustainability of these colonies depended on the ability of Europeans to create a more enduring system of rule. The dynamic that I want to talk about now that would shape world history, we call, thanks to a very well-known historian called Alfred Crosby, the Columbian Exchange. The exchange, almost inscribed in the image by de Bry, between the New World and the Old. And we can ask ourselves, how did the Old World in this exchange mechanism refashion the New? And vice versa. How did the New change the Old? Exchange means that the dynamics go both ways. It's a reciprocal flow of influence. Now, this does not mean that the deal was fair. It was an asymmetrical exchange. Clearest of all in the demographic effects. For what Europeans brought to the Americas wiped out entire populations. And indeed, what the Americans offered to Europeans and to Asians allowed for a population explosion in Eurasia. So in this deal, what did the Americas get? Well, the first thing they got were, of course, the microbes. In the first 100 years that ensued, the first century after European contact with the Americas, the native population declined from, and I have to say the figures are very contested on this, but the generally accepted figure that the population pre-contact hovered between 100 million and 120 million within the first century declined dramatically to about 20 million. So that's from what, 100 to 120 million down to 20 million. In fact, there were 14 separate epidemics that would spread across the New World. Indians, watching their kin die, were so enraged by what they felt was an abandonment by the gods, or understandably seen as violence perpetrated by the Europeans, lashed out in response. Some were known to knead their infected blood into their master's bread, hoping that they would spread the disease back to the Europeans. They would put into the wells infected bodies, hoping that the Europeans would pick up the disease. Of course, they did not understand resistances, but the fact was the Europeans came with diseases that the Europeans didn't even know they had, and had built up resistances from many, many years of encounters with these pathogens. The worst of the diseases were the eruptive fevers, smallpox, measles, and typhus, destroying entire cultures and societies. Wow, that was contribution number one. Contribution number two was in the form of flora. What the Europeans brought with them were crops: cotton, rice, indigo, bananas, and most of all, and we'll come back to this in a later lecture, sugar. Sugar that would be produced on plantations, as I said earlier, and I'm going to repeat this over and over again because it's very important for you to understand, not for local consumption. Sugar produced in the New World for somebody else's consumption. So, the Europeans then spread their crops to the New World, and there they would devise new systems of production to grow their semi-tropical or tropical commodities. So number one, the biota. Number two, the flora. And number three was, of course, other megafauna: horses, cattle, sheep, pigs. Pigs, in fact, were the quickest to adapt. And many Caribbean islands were soon overrun by these pigs. Many of them went feral, went wild, because they had no natural predator. And they would destroy the habitat of many of these islands, eating the grasses and plants that they found. Pigs made a wonderful source of sustenance for other Europeans who began to colonize the islands. Here I have a little story for you, Jeff. It's about the origins of the term barbecue. And it comes from the term that pirates would use as they would go to Caribbean islands. They would establish a settlement trying to hide away from rival navies, and they would live off roasted pigs. That they would roast open pigs that they would capture in the wild that had been brought by Europeans, and they would roast them and eat them from tail to head, right? From barbe, a beard in French, to tail or queue. And so that's how we get the idea of a barbecue emerging. So while we think of the conquistador on his horse as the icon of a European conquest of the Americas, probably a more accurate image would be a European pirate roasting a pig in an open spit. Okay, this was an exchange relationship, right? It goes both ways. It's an unfair exchange, but it goes both ways. And I want you to bear that in mind as you think about the logic of this relationship. Natives gave back. Well, the first thing they gave back were their own biota, right? Most important of all is syphilis. Sailors quickly picked up venereal diseases from indigenous peoples, carried them back to Europe, quickly infected the armies of Spain, and soldiers are magnificent purveyors of diseases. The sailors and soldiers carried the diseases to brothels, and particularly since extensive raping was an instrument of warfare at the time, the disease quickly spread. Most European armies, by the end of the 16th century, were afflicted with syphilis. Indeed, one can imagine them as walking columns of venereal disease. Venereal disease spread with amazing speed. By 1498, it's been picked up in India, and by 1505, there is evidence of it erupting in China. So, the Indians gave back their own version of biota, number one. Number two, they also contributed their own flora. Tomatoes, maize, cocoa, they all came from the New World. These were domesticated plants that indigenous people had developed over the course of many centuries of their own version of experimentation. But perhaps most important was the humble potato. It was versatile, adaptable to many climates, and yielded calories per hectare that were much greater, in fact, than many of the staples that Eurasians relied upon. And it was quickly seen as a point I've made earlier, when people are attracted to something new and exotic, quickly treat it initially as an aphrodisiac, and then it becomes a staple. Potatoes quickly became a cheap food source. The final contribution that Indians made to global history was precious metals, gold and silver above all. I'm going to get back to that element in the next lecture. What's important for you to think about in closing this lecture is what we might call an ecological windfall. That Europeans found in the Americas access to a cheap source of food, ready access to precious metals that would transform the balance of world power between the east of Eurasia and the west of Eurasia. It would give to Europeans resources, assets that they could use to redefine their relationships with the rest of the world. So we begin to see Europe's emergence from internecine, fractured struggle on what might be considered the miserable western fringe of Afro-Eurasia into a very different source of power.